So with that, I'm going to maybe kick off with our first speaker of the day. It's my pleasure to introduce John Ferguson. John is the Global Head of New Globalisation at the Economist Impact, where he leads a research team on topics related to trade, supply chain, geopolitical and finance. And these are all topics which are very relevant to IDA as the global economy is being transformed by multiple forces, including geopolitics and technical progress. Please join me in welcoming John to the stage. Thank you.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all. For the next 20 minutes or so, I want to give you what I call a new globalisation outlook, sort of a bit of a macro outlook for the global economy, and then a bit on trade and supply chains and FDI. But before I jump into that, I do want to briefly talk about who I am and who we are. Hopefully, many of you will know the Economist newspaper, born in 1843. Some of you may know the Economist Intelligence Unit, which was born in 1946, and that's the sort of forecasting arm of the Economist Group. Economist Impact is new. We were born in 2021, so a bit over 2 years old, and you can think of us as a think tank within the Economist Group, and we sort of try and do great research with partner companies and amplify that research around the world. So some of the insights and research I'll be sharing with you have come from our work with our clients around the world. Michael mentioned new globalisation. So to put all of this view in context, at Economist Impact, we do think we're in a new chapter for globalisation, and that's because of this unprecedented convergence of these major fundamental factors, we call them. The fourth industrial revolution, and AI is a big part of that, geopolitical shifts, and climate change. So these three things have happened before in human history, but we think they're coming together in a unique way. And that's what we mean about new globalisation and a new chapter for all of us. So for the next few minutes, I want to give a bit of a sort of a global macro outlook before I then go into trade and supply chains and FDI. I've got a phrase here, cautious optimism, and briefly chatting with some of your colleagues this morning, I think maybe that's a reasonable term for 2024. This is a bit of a sort of a global story, a bit of a heat map to tell you where growth may come from, and I'll just touch on a couple of these things. The US economy probably should avoid a recession this year, which is called a soft landing in sort of economist jargon. That's a good thing, given how Michael was saying how important the US economy is for the Irish economy. So it looks like the US will avoid that recession. There are some political headwinds or political risks with a very funny man with strange hair who may change things, but that's a risk for the global economy I'll come back to shortly. Europe looks to rebound in 2024 and maybe match growth of about 0.9%. There is some growth. You'll see that red, in this chart, red is a good thing. Vietnam, Thailand, these countries are looking to grow pretty quickly in 2024, and that's benefiting from some of that supply chain diversification that I'll talk about shortly. But with any forecast, and I'm sure you're all well accustomed to forecasting anything, it all rests on assumptions. This assumes the war in Ukraine enters a stalemate. So if that moved in either direction, that would really change the economic picture that I'm talking about here. The war in the Middle East, we've seen the news yesterday. If that escalates to something more regional, that changes things. And also China and Taiwan. That relatively benign forecast we have here assumes that nothing kicks off regarding Taiwan. So there's a lot of assumptions that underpin that forecast, but that's where we see the global economy in 2024. A couple of really, the cautious optimism comes from two areas, inflation and interest rates. And just these charts very briefly, hopefully we've passed the cost of living crisis. Inflation is slowing down. So we've got developing and developed countries here basically coming down in the developed world to around 2%, which is a good thing. And that's driven by sort of some of that supply chain pressures easing. Now there are risks to that forecast with any forecast, but this is a good thing. This is a good thing that inflation is coming down and getting back to more normal levels. But when we think about interest rates, which is sort of the flip side of inflation from a macroeconomic point of view, we don't think they're going to go back to where they were for the last 10 to 12 years after the global financial crisis. So that's why all those lines sort of flatten out in the later years of the forecast period. So, inflation is coming down, but it is going to sort of stay around that 2%. So that is higher than what we've been experiencing the last decade, say, and central banks, in response to that, will essentially be slowly bringing down their interest rates, but not to the levels we saw in the past decade. So this is a new normal of interest rates and inflation. It's still cautiously optimistic. It's better than what we went through with COVID, but this is a cautiously optimistic picture of the global economy. And that's sort of the environment that many of your clients and potential clients and partners are all operating in. They're cautiously optimistic about what they're seeing over the next few years. But now I want to share some research with you from my team at Economist Impact on what we call global trade in transition. And yeah, Michael mentioned it again, there's a lot of disruption. We really do think global trade is in transition. So for the last few years, we've been surveying, I think, around 3,000 executives, asking them about their sort of supply chain and trade patterns and optimism and so forth. And I just want to share just a few key highlights with you. This is one of my favorites. We asked these 3,000 executives involved in sort of trade and supply chains, like physically, geographically, what are you doing with your supply chains? For the last 2 years, and I'll be in Davos in a couple of weeks to launch the latest results, and they're very similar to what we have here. But for 21 and 22, the biggest strategy of companies was diversification. Almost 50%, and that makes sense. I talk to executives who say, I'm ending single sourcing for our most. I'm a manufacturer. I'm really ending single sourcing for our most critical product. And that's a diversification strategy. That all costs money, but in the unfortunate, unpredictable world we live in, diversification is the dominant strategy. The next one there of around 20%, and the latest figures I'll launch in a couple of weeks are about the same, 20%. So 1 in 5 companies are regionalizing or nearshoring. So if you're in America, that might be Mexico. If you're in Asia, that might be Vietnam or Thailand. And maybe that's Ireland here in Europe. Right, but basically bringing your supply chains, bringing your production closer to your consumers, and that's about 1 in 5 companies. Now, many politicians, I'm not sure if any politicians are in the room, policymakers, but onshoring is not a major strategy. Many policymakers around the world, particularly in the developed world, want reshoring or onshoring. That's not a major strategy, but there are some companies engaging in that. But clearly, that diversification of supply chains is the biggest strategy. We also asked these companies, these executives, about how you're thinking about geopolitics, and almost 100%. The vast majority of companies are responding to geopolitical events. They're taking a range of different sort of strategies. They are diversifying. They're expanding into more stable markets, and that we chatted this morning about. Ireland really is, your country, where you are, a really stable market. That's a real benefit for you all, but stability matters in this environment. But there are other strategies like doing more due diligence. But basically you can see that almost every company we survey and that I talk to, geopolitics is a central part of their supply chain strategy. And the other one I want to share is, this is one of my favorite charts. It doesn't look that exciting, but hopefully I'll make it exciting. But nothing to me says we're in a new chapter of globalization than this simple chart. Now, when I first learned about supply chains, 20 years ago, when I had less grey hair, it was this beautiful just-in-time sort of process. I think the Japanese started it, but it was just, you only got your parts of your supply chain to that certain market only when necessary, and then it got, put together, and then it moved on. We now live in a new chapter of globalization. We're now in a very different sort of global economy, as I've mentioned. And what we've asked companies here in this part of the survey is, what is the period of time you're building up your inventories? Right? So if the world was perfect, if the world was perfectly stable, that sort of light blue at the start, that 13 and 40% would dominate. That's just in time. That's a just-in-time supply chain. But as you can see, that is a really small number compared to all the other numbers. So to simplify this chart, basically the vast majority of companies are operating what we call just-in-case supply chain management. And this is because of the unpredictable world we live in. This is also very costly. And the executives I talk to are also pulling their hair out because it's also very complicated. Where do you build your inventory? And I see tensions in the C-suite between the sort of chief supply chain officer and the chief finance officer or the treasurer, right? Because this costs money. This takes up capital, but this is the world we live in. Companies are trying to build up their inventory to prepare for shocks. I still think this is a work in progress, right? They're still trying to find out that right balance between efficiency and preparing for risk. But this is definitely the new state of supply chain management that we see at Economist Impact. So now I want to talk a little bit more about FDI. And I work for the Economist Group. I wouldn't be allowed to work for the Economist Group if I didn't believe in trade and FDI. So I'm a big trade and FDI person. When I think about trade and FDI, two fundamental factors: resilience and sustainability. It'd be nice if it was just sustainability, but resilience really matters. And I just want to share a couple of slides on sort of risk factors and why resilience is so important for global companies these days. What I have here are the top 10 risks from my colleagues at the EIU, the intelligence unit. These are the top 10 sort of global risk scenarios over the next 2 years that my colleagues think could impact global companies. And what you can see here they're many and varied. There are climate change impacts impacting global supply chains. There's clearly geopolitics that we've already mentioned, the war in Ukraine, the potential regional war in the Middle East, and China and Taiwan. But there are also just political risks. This year, 2024, is a huge, huge election year, and possibly none more important than what's happening in the US or what will happen in the US, right? There are vast differences between the Biden administration and a potential Trump administration, right? There are vast differences. So these are huge global risks for global companies. So what does that mean? All of this sort of global environment means companies are focusing on resilience. Now, it is a buzzword. It is, but I do think it's a buzzword for a reason. So on another research project, I wanted to understand how companies, again, because when I first learned about sort of trade, supply chains, and business operations, it was all about efficiency. So we conducted this separate research project that asked companies about how are you balancing this tension between resilience and efficiency. So we did another survey. This is a different group of sort of business leaders across the world, and we asked them to self-identify. As a company, are you prioritizing resilience or are you prioritizing efficiency? And you can see we got some really clear differences between companies here. Again, self-identified companies. But I think it really tells an important story. The companies who are focusing on resilience had a very different view when it came to sort of flexibility versus being prescriptive. They had a very different view of whether or not they're focusing on the long term or the short term. And they had a very different view of whether they were taking sort of a holistic cross-functional planning approach or a very specific planning approach. Now, if I stand back a little bit and think about this research, which I've done a lot, I can think about a spectrum of global companies of how they view the next 5 or 10 years. At one end of the spectrum, everyone thinks, oh, the world's lovely, everyone's going to get along great, they've got nothing to worry about. At that end of the spectrum, I think that's the companies who are purely focusing on efficiency. Now, it's not black and white, it's a spectrum. But at the other end of the spectrum, I think there are companies who maybe listen to me and listen to Economist Impact and realize how difficult the world is. And at this end of the spectrum, those are the companies focusing on resilience. They're focusing on how to be flexible. They're focusing on the long term. They're thinking more holistically about their sort of strategy and planning. So I think any client, any partner you talk to, they are balancing this tension, and I think this is really important for trade and FDI. But if I now just come to sort of FDI, and I'll hopefully do this quickly and we can take any questions, but the global context, UNCTAD is an organisation I look to a lot for the data. In 2022, there was a decline. 23 numbers haven't come out yet, but I wouldn't expect a huge sort of rebound. But a couple of big important trends I'm seeing. Industrial policies. Doesn't sound very exciting, but these are really big deals, right? The Economist Group, the Economist newspaper hate industrial policies. They really do hate industrial policies. They hate governments getting in the way, right? I'm less right, whatever, but the fact is industrial policies are a new normal. Everyone's doing it. Everyone's doing industrial policies, right? The Chips and Sciences Act, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, these are big, big deals, and these matter for companies' decisions around trade and FDI. In the UK, that wonderful country where I live, right, where it's always raining, the potential Labour government, Rachel Reeves, has a huge long document with lots of red on it called Securonomics. If Labour wins, which they probably will, Labour is going to embark on a huge sort of industrial policy about trying to attract companies to the UK. Everyone's doing it, right? And as someone who believes in openness and trade, I'm not a massive fan of industrial policies, but this is a really big thing for companies to deal with. And the last one there is just investment screening regimes. Again, just the number of countries doing these screening mechanisms are increasing. Now, I get it. I'm an economist. I'm not in national security, but I get the national security concerns. The only point I would say is, can we make these a little bit more efficient, less daunting, and let's make sure we're not hurting companies who do want to invest, right, in Ireland or Australia or the UK or whatever. So these are some really big factors that are impacting FDI. But when I talk to companies, whether it's in the research we do or just I do a lot of sort of roundtables and sort of Chatham House rules conversations, these are some of the factors I believe are really valued by companies in this new chapter of globalisation. None of this is a surprise to you, but I just want to share it anyway. Talent and skills. And what my parents are school teachers in Australia, lovely, lovely people. But education is clearly important. But what I'm fascinated by is education in this new chapter, in this world of disruption and all the things we're talking about. When I talk to these company executives, they don't just talk about, you know, the accounting degree or the engineering degree or this, whatever it is. They talk about a learning and change mindset, right? And this is really fascinating to me. My lovely parents had one job all their whole life. I think that's gone, right? People are going to be changing careers. So how do we create these education systems that, you know, make change and lifelong learning a genuine part of what we do? And I think that's what we need to do, and I think companies are going to value people who are not just having that core base of knowledge, but they're able to change and have that sort of learning mindset. In the middle there, business and operations support. I think as companies look for FDI and they're sort of diversifying their supply chains, they're going to be looking for a lot of sort of support, that sort of local economy support, business support. They're thinking about all these regulatory requirements, all the sustainability stuff that really matters. They're thinking about, you know, how can they get support on risk and resilience, you know, scenario planning, these sorts of things. And trust. I know it sounds silly, but trust is such a big thing in today's global market, right? And I think the Irish, you are trusted, you're stable. That's a really big benefit for you all. But companies are challenged by trust. They're not sure if policy is going to change. They're not sure if the partners they deal with are going to change. Do they have exposure to Russia, China, et cetera, et cetera? Trust is a really, really big thing. So I just think that it might sound silly, but trust is really important. And finally, there on the right, there, just the English language. I think given the Brits' decision to leave the EU, great decision for Britain there, but Ireland is a stepping stone. You know, I think you're really well positioned to sort of be that stepping stone to the EU. And finally, before I stop talking, I do think there are some sort of opportunities amid all this uncertainty, particularly for a country like Ireland. But I do want to think about, I'm going to talk about this all 2024. Can we have industrial policies that are pro-trade? Can we have government policies that support trade and FDI that don't impinge trade and FDI? Jake Sullivan, some of you may seen his speech last year. He talked about, for US technology, he talked about a small garden with a high fence, right? Small garden with a high fence. Can we make that garden as small as possible? Because if policymakers around the world make that garden really, really big, that makes it harder for FDI to come into your countries, right? Can we streamline those screening procedures, as I mentioned? Can we avoid local content requirements, right? All that stuff are barriers for companies and FDI. And finally, can we think about supporting the factors of production? You know, R&D is a big thing here in Ireland, which is really positive. Supporting talent and supporting infrastructure, right? So these are the things that I think will support FDI rather than put up barriers to incoming FDI into Ireland, the UK, Australia, or whatever. So when I think about all of that and I think about the Irish example, I think you're in a really, really strong position. I think your life sciences, your technology, your trust, your stability, your global business services, I think all these things put you guys in a really strong position in this world that's full of uncertainty. But listen, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take any questions. I think I've got about a minute or so, but thanks so much for listening to me. Wonderful, wonderful. So we only have a minute or so, but let me just answer. Why do you predict the supply chain? Where do you predict the supply chain chart will land or stabilize? That's a really great question. I think diversification is going to continue to be a really dominant strategy for global companies. I'm not predicting onshoring. So that onshoring or reshoring might stay around 5-10%. So I don't think that onshoring is a huge part of it. I do think there are benefits to trade. So maybe a little bit more on the regionalisation and less on the onshoring. Why is the English language more important in a post-Brexit world? I just think with the Brits putting up barriers, they're putting up barriers. So for English-speaking countries, English-speaking companies around the world, particularly looking to the EU, Ireland and the language here just opens up a real door to the EU. So I do think just the English language is a real benefit. And maybe the last one, because I should really get kicked off. Thanks so much for all the questions. In the context of industrial policies that you referenced, how do you see the fight for FDI evolving in the context of an increasingly aggressive incentive environment? Yeah, this is a really important question. I know industrial policies don't sound exciting, but they really are important. I think, unfortunately for me and the Economist group, industrial policies are going to continue to be anti-trade. Governments are going to try and put up barriers, local content requirements, incentives for domestic production. Now, for trade and FDI, that's a bad thing. So I think that the trend on industrial policies is not good, but then eventually people will realise the folly of their ways, hopefully listen to us and the Economist group more, and then eventually there'll be a bit more of a pro-trade industrial policies. But listen, I should get off the stage. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really wish you all the well for your conference.
Thank you very much, John. That was really insightful to get your views, and I think resonates a number of areas there. We talk about resilience and sustainability. The learning mindset. I think that's something that we in IDA are certainly committed to with our client companies, and also as a trusted partner. And I think trusted partners have to always embed that trust as well. So I think there's some lessons there for us as well. So really appreciate you taking time to come over from rainy the UK to rainy Ireland. But thank you very much for taking time.